Thank you. This is the Saturday Armenian School students from St. Paul Armenian Church. Thank you very much. We're going to give them 30 seconds to get off stage. Thank you again. Our keynote speaker today has a list of accomplishments a mile long. He has been a publisher, syndicated columnist, TV commentator, political analyst, author, award-winning documentary producer, lecturer, and United Nations delegate on human rights. Under his leadership, the Armenian Artsakh Fund, previously the United Armenian Fund, has spent $770 million of humanitarian aid, has sent $770 million of humanitarian aid to Armenia and Artsakh since 1989. As Senior Vice President of Kirk Kerkorian's Lindsay Foundation, he was in charge of $242 million of infrastructure projects in Armenia. Since 1983, Mr. Sasunian has been the publisher and editor of the California Courier newspaper. He has a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University in New York and an MBA from Pepperdine University in Los Angeles. We're honored to have him with us this morning. Please give a big Fresno welcome to Mr. Haduk Sasunian.
Good afternoon. I'm honored to be here, to be invited to Fresno, the heartland of the Armenian community for over a century. Honorable clergy, distinguished elected officials, and Sireli Hayranagitsner. My topic today is titled Quest for Justice, or genocide recognition. Over 100 years after the genocide and its recognition by dozens of countries, 48 states, international organizations, and scholars, Armenians should at long last consider the recognition stage over and turn their full attention to demanding restitution and justice. Let us quickly review developments of this issue over the past 100 years. In the immediate aftermath of the genocide, most of the survivors were scattered throughout the Middle East and other distant lands. They had no food, no shelter, and barely the clothes on their back. They vainly hoped to be rescued by Christian European nations to return to their ancestral homeland in Western Armenia and Cilicia, from which they were so brutally uprooted. Alas, it was not to be. On August 10, 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed by over a dozen countries, including the British Empire, France, Italy, Japan, Turkey, and Armenia. The leaders of these countries were committed to restore justice to the long-suffering Armenian nation. The Treaty of Sèvres recognized Armenia's independence and asked President Woodrow Wilson to fix the borders between Armenia and Turkey. Unfortunately, this treaty was never ratified. The European powers reneged on their commitments to their little ally. The newly established Republic of Armenia lasted only 2 years before being swallowed up by the Soviet Union and Turkey. The destitute Armenian refugees, abandoned to their tragic fate, were forced to settle down in permanent exile. In those early years, their first priority was survival, fending off starvation and disease. Gradually, they rebuilt their lives in new homes, churches, and schools. Engaging in lobbying activities and making political demands were the last things on their minds. Every April 24, Armenians commemorated the genocide in church halls, offering prayers for the souls of the 1.5 million innocent victims. Successive generations, particularly after 1965, the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, tried to break the wall of silence surrounding the greatest tragedy that befell the Armenian nation. Tens of thousands of Armenians in communities throughout the world held protest marches, wrote letters to government officials, and petitioned international organizations. The Turkish government, along with the rest of the world, initially turned a deaf ear to Armenian demands for acknowledgement of the long-forgotten genocide. But as media outlets, world leaders, parliaments of various countries, and international organizations began acknowledging the Armenian genocide, Turkish leaders, astonished that the crimes perpetrated by their forefathers were making headlines after so many decades, pumped massive resources into their campaign of denial, funded foreign scholars to distort the historical facts, engaged the services of powerful lobbying firms, and applied political and economic pressure on countries acknowledging the genocide. Since 1965, dozens of countries, including Canada, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, Belgium, Greece, Russia, Sweden, Argentina, and Uruguay have recognized Armenian genocide. Even though it is commonly assumed that the United States has not acknowledged the Armenian genocide, the fact is that all three branches of the American government, executive, legislative, and judiciary, have repeatedly acknowledged Armenian genocide. The first time that the executive branch made a reference to the Armenian genocide was all the way back in 1951 in a document filed by the US government with the International Court of Justice, known as the World Court. The second reference to the Armenian genocide by the executive branch was made by President Ronald Reagan when he issued Presidential Proclamation 4838 on April 22, 1981. The legislative branch of the US government adopted two resolutions confirming the historical facts of the Armenian genocide. The first resolution, approved by the US House of Representatives on April 8, 1975, designated April 24, and I quote from the resolution, as a day of remembrance for all the victims of genocide, especially those of Armenian ancestry, who succumbed to the genocide perpetrated in 1915. A second resolution was adopted by the House of Representatives on September 10, 1984, designating April 24, 1985, and I quote, as a day of remembrance for all the victims of genocide, especially the 1.5 million people of Armenian ancestry who were the victims of the genocide perpetrated in Turkey between 1915 and 1923. Most people are unaware that the judiciary, the third branch of the US government, has issued 3 federal court rulings concerning the Armenian genocide. Thus, with all 3 branches of the US government going on record reaffirming the genocide, the United States has gained its rightful place in the ranks of righteous nations that have recognized Armenian genocide. In fact, in many respects, the United States has compiled a more extensive record of acknowledging the Armenian genocide than many other countries that have merely adopted a parliamentary resolution on this issue. International organizations have also acknowledged Armenian genocide, including the United Nations. The UN Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities adopted a report in 1985 acknowledging that the Armenian genocide met all the UN criteria for genocide. 2 years later, in 1987, the European Parliament adopted a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide. In addition, hundreds of Holocaust and genocide scholars have issued joint statements confirming the facts of the Armenian genocide. After so many acknowledgments, the Armenian genocide has become a universally recognized historical fact. Regrettably, despite such widespread acknowledgement, some countries have yet to recognize the Armenian genocide. The countries that side with the denialist regime of Turkey are not doing so due to lack of evidence or conviction, but sadly, because of political expediency with the intent of appeasing the denier. One would hope that these governments would join most of the enlightened world in acknowledging the historical facts as they are and not as the Turkish government wishes them to be. Armenians no longer need to convince the world that what took place during the years 1915 to 1923 was a genocide. This is why it makes no difference whether President Trump acknowledges the Armenian genocide or the Congress passes another resolution on the Armenian genocide. It's all done before. No need to repeat past acknowledgement. However, the simple acknowledgement of what took place and mere apology would not heal the wounds and undo the consequences of the genocide. Armenians are still waiting for justice to be served, restoring their historic rights, and returning their confiscated lands and properties. In recent years, Armenian-American lawyers have successfully filed lawsuits in U.S. federal courts, securing millions of dollars from New York Life and French AXA insurance companies for unpaid claims to policyholders who perished in the genocide. In 1915, a centrally planned attempt was made to uproot from its ancestral homeland and decimate an entire nation, depriving the survivors of their cultural heritage, as well as their homes, lands, houses of worship, and personal properties. A gross injustice was perpetrated against the Armenian people, entitling them, as in the case of the Jewish Holocaust, to just compensation for their enormous losses. Restitution can take many forms. As an initial step, the Republic of Turkey should place under the jurisdiction of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul all the Armenian churches and religious monuments which were expropriated and converted to mosques and warehouses or outright destroyed. In the absence of a voluntary restitution by Turkey, Armenia should resort to litigation seeking restorative justice. In considering legal recourse, one should keep in mind that the Armenian genocide did neither start nor end in 1915. Large-scale killings were committed, starting with Sultan Abdul Hamid's massacre of 300,000 Armenians from 1894 to 1896. The subsequent killing